Doctor, returning to a part of your testimony this morning, you discussed a statement that Melody Dishman made. And you said that you read Ms. Dishman's deposition, correct?
Yes.
All right, and that's where, and when did you read that deposition?
That was a day or two before my testimony started.
So, just last week?
Yes.
All right. Do you have any idea when that deposition was taken?
It was taken maybe a day or two before that.
All right. I don't need a long explanation. A deposition, what is that?
A deposition is when attorneys, usually the opposing attorney, is able to ask questions of a witness in order to get information as far as what they are going to testify to in general.
All right. So, it's just a statement, right?
Correct.
And how old was Mr. Jonchuck when he made that statement?
12 years old.
Is it uncommon for 12-year-olds to say stupid things?
No.
The fact that he may have said that when he was 12, does that prove his mental state on January 7th and 8th of 2015?
Obviously not.
In testifying, you talked about John's recollection and what he told you about what happened on top of the bridge that night.
Yes.
Did John tell you the sequence of when he pulled over versus when the police officer turned on his lights and things like that?
Yes.
What did John tell you?
John told me that he stopped after the officer put on his lights.
Is that true?
Not according to Officer Vickers.
The state asked you if speeding away from the top of the bridge at speeds of upwards of 90 miles an hour, if that was evidence of fleeing. Is it?
It could be.
Okay. Now, with a police officer behind you and slowly pulling to the side of the road and using your turn signal to indicate you're pulling to the right-hand side of the road, and then using your turn signal the opposite way before you conduct a slow-speed U-turn, is that evidence of fleeing and eluding?
No.
The state or the prosecutor asked you if you had spoken to specific people in conducting your evaluation. We talked about on Friday the things that you take, that you use to conduct your evaluation in order to form your opinion. And they asked you if you had talked to certain people. Is there a reason why you didn't talk to those people?
Yes.
Could you tell the jury what it is?
From the information that I reviewed, it was quite extensive in regards to aspects of his mental illness, as well as observations during the time just before, during, and after the offense. Those records were quite substantial, and then I was also able to review depositions that provided me other information from those individuals.
How many delusions can you have?
You can have many.
So, if you have a delusion that you're God, can you not have a delusion that you're the Pope?
No.
The fact that you have the delusion that you're the Pope and then later on have a delusion that you're God, does that mean that the one earlier was wrong or that you were not psychotic at that time?
No.
You're asked questions about a personality disorder. Can you explain to the jury the process that we talked about, that little purple book, the DSM-5? That's what a guideline, but I don't know how to describe that. It's the authoritative book on
Making diagnoses, yes.
Okay. When you are conducting an evaluation to form an opinion as to someone, whether someone has mental illness or personality disorder, how do you do that? Does the DSM-5 tell you how to do that?
Yes.
Did you follow the DSM-5 in this case?
Yes.
So you did what it told you to do?
Yes.
And what did you do?
Well, what it says in regards to a personality disorder, if the symptoms of that personality disorder can be better explained by another mental disorder in the DSM-5, then you are to diagnose them with that mental disorder and not the personality disorder. And as it comes to antisocial personality disorder, it's very specific. If those symptoms are attributable to a bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, then it contraindicates a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder.
Okay. Contraindicates. Explain that word to me.
It means you don't diagnose them with antisocial personality disorder.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Are delusions, is that evidence of a personality disorder?
No.
Are hallucinations evidence of a personality disorder?
No.
Disorganized thinking, is that evidence of a personality disorder?
Distractibility can be.
Okay. But not delusions and hallucinations?
No.
You were asked if these delusions that he was having, that he was the Pope, that he was God, that he and Phoebe had to die in order to save the world, that there was an ice age coming. Can you rationalize those delusions for us?
No.
Why not?
Because they're irrational.
Is that the definition of a delusion? An irrational belief?
Yes.
Are you offering any opinion as to which of those delusions explains what he did?
It's looking at the totality of the delusions, looking at all the delusions together.
And the purpose of your testimony was to offer an opinion as to what?
To whether he was insane at the time of the offense.
And were you ever asked to offer an opinion as to which delusion explained something?
No.
That's all I have, Judge.
More cross, Mr. Bowler?
No.
Okay. Should Dr. Mackles be excused, or should he be on standby?
Should be on standby, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony. You're on standby, Dr. Mackles.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yeah.
Oh. Questions, okay. If you pass them to the deputy, please. Thank you.
There was no drug test.
Question mark.
It does not indicate that. Please repeat the question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's more evidence of disorganized thinking. He's traveling, he's breaking all the rules of the road, traveling the wrong way on a highway, and yet he's still putting on his blinker. If anything, that shows very disorganized, grossly disorganized behavior, as well as disorganized thinking.
Ms. Ressler, does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else have any more questions for Dr. Mackles? Okay, you're on standby. Thank you. Oops. Got one. Is it better for the doctor personally interview more of the witnesses, police, doctors, etc.?
Can I add something?
Yes.
And why?
Okay.
The answer is it depends. If there is extensive information in previous interviews, no matter who does those interviews, then whether personally the doctor, the mental health expert interviews that person, it's not that important as long as the information is there, whether it's gotten through other sources or whether those individuals are interviewed directly by the doctor.
Do you have a why that you still want to ask?
Yeah, I just wondering if it's, if it would change any of, doctor, if it would change any of your conclusions.
Well, I
If you
review.
personally did it instead of.
I'm sorry. The information from the police reports and the depositions were very, very extensive. They interviewed those individuals right after the offense, when the information is freshest. And so there's a lot of really great information that is obtained right after the offense in doing this type of evaluation. I was also afforded the opportunity to review depositions. And so in my case, it seems like all the information was already out there. To have interviewed them in addition did not seem that it would produce any significant information that could be used in the opinion that was not already used.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Miranda? Okay. Thank you. I don't know who wrote this question, but it's going to get answered. Is it possible that the email was poorly written due to only going to the 8th grade and perhaps not disorganized writing? Whose was that? Thank you.
Well, from the background information that he reported, he was in honors classes, and he also started to take some courses in a community college. So I would expect that the writing on the email would have been better.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you. Counsel? another one. Spice show up on a drug test, that will get answered. Do you know the answer, Dr.?
I don't know the answer.
All right, who wrote that one, please? Thank you. All right, anyone else have any more questions for this witness? Okay, you're on standby, thank you.
Thank you.
Can they call your next witness?
Since calls Dr. Randy Otto. Otto.
Sir, if you would step over here for me, please. Just stand right here, face this front, put your right hand, we'll take you over.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do. All right, sir, you have a seat in the red chair, speaking in a loud and clear voice for the court.
Morning,
Move up
Dr.
close to that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you could please turn and introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name for the record.
My name is Randy Kurt Otto, O-T-T-O.
And what is your current business address?
I have two addresses. I have a primary appointment at the University of South Florida. I'm a faculty member there. I have a private office as well, fully independent of the university. That address is 13701 Bruce Downs Boulevard, Suite 111, Tampa, Florida.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a professor at the University of South Florida. That's a full-time appointment. I'm also associate chair of the department in which I work. That's the Department of Mental Health Law and Policy. In addition to that, I have a psychology practice that's independent of the university, that's essentially limited to evaluating people who are involved in legal proceedings, criminal defendants. People may be involved in civil litigation where there's some question about their psychological functioning and how it might be relevant to some legal issue and dispute.
Okay. And what kinds of work do you do for the University of South Florida?
I teach courses in the psychology department, the criminology department, the counseling department, and my department, mental health law and policy. Those courses range from professional ethics to forensic psychology to undergraduate ethics.
How long have you been at the University of South Florida?
Since the summer of '89, 30 years this June.
And do you do any additional training at USF other than the courses you teach?
So yes, I teach as most university faculty do. And throughout my tenure at the university, I've conducted continuing education for professionals already established in the field. That's part of my job description. So unlike a lot of university professors, I spend a fair amount of my time educating other established professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and I also spend some time with the legal community, maybe offering presentations to judges or groups of attorneys, things like that.
What kinds of work do you do in your private practice?
It's all limited to evaluating people who are involved in litigation. I don't provide any therapy or anything like that. The overwhelming majority of people that I evaluate are criminal defendants or kids in the juvenile justice system. So I would say 75% or 80% of the time when I'm evaluating people, they're involved in the criminal justice or juvenile justice system in some way. And then maybe 20% of the time, 15% of the time, I'm evaluating or conducting evaluations in civil contexts, testamentary capacity, guardianship, disability, personal injury, things like that.
Could you give us a little bit of background in your education and training that allows you to perform the work you do?
Sure. A bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester in psychology, which I earned in 1981. Immediately thereafter, I enrolled at Florida State University in Tallahassee. I was there for a total of 5 years. Along the way, I earned a master's degree and a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. As part of that training, I had to complete a one-year internship, and that was done at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. I left all that with a PhD in clinical psychology, and then I found my way to Lincoln, Nebraska. I completed a 2-year fellowship in the College of Law and the Department of Psychology. That was a fellowship that was focused on interactions between law and psychology, and during that fellowship, during my 2 years there, I earned a master's degree in legal studies. That was kind of my formal training, and throughout my graduate training, throughout my postdoctoral training, really the focus of my interest and the focus of my work was interactions between the legal and the mental health systems.
Do you hold any licenses?
Licensed to practice psychology in the state of Florida and the state of Hawaii.
And what about any advanced certifications?
I'm board certified in clinical psychology. I'm board certified in forensic psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology.
Are you aware of whether Dr. Macklis is board certified?
I believe he is.
Same.
Have you received any awards or commendations for your work?
Along the way, if you're lucky enough to pick up awards, you are. I received an award from the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, a professional group of forensic psychologists for its career contributions to the practice of forensic psychology. Received an award for my forensic psychology work from the New York State Psychological Association, and I received an award for my work from University of California, San Francisco.
Have you published any books or articles?
Right. So if you're at a university, they want you to publish things. I've published, I'll estimate, I haven't counted, 50, 60 articles in the professional literature. And the overwhelming majority of those articles are focused on interactions between the legal and the mental health systems. Some of those articles address issues like we're here to address today. I've published, I've authored or co-authored or edited approximately 8 or 9 books. Most of those books are focused on interactions between the law and mental health. I'm a co-author of a book called Psychological Evaluations for the Courts, a guide for mental health professionals and attorneys. I co-authored a book on forensic psychology ethics. I co-authored a book on report writing and expert testimony. I edited a book on violence risk assessment, co-authored a book on the law of Florida for mental health professionals.
And those articles and books, would those have been peer reviewed?
The articles in journals are peer reviewed. Books are a little different. The way they do that is the editor, the publisher contracts with you. You write the manuscript, then they send it to a couple of your peers, and they just sort of make sure that it makes sense and it's a reasonable thing to publish. But the peer review associated with books, I don't think is as demanding as the peer review associated with articles.
What type of forensic evaluations on criminal defendants do you regularly conduct?
I think you can put them in 3 categories. Competence, whether they're competent to stand trial, whether they're experiencing some kind of disorders that make it so they can't understand and participate in the legal process, or if they can. The second kind of evaluation is the evaluation like I conducted in this case, evaluating someone's mental state at and around the time of the offense, to inform judges or jurors' opinions about whether they should be held criminally responsible or not. And then the third type of what I'll call criminal evaluation that I conduct is what you might call a sentencing evaluation. After someone's pled guilty or been convicted, the evaluation might focus on aspects of their emotional, behavioral, or cognitive functioning that might be relevant to informing the judge's decision about the kind of sentence or the appropriateness of a sentence. If there's some mental health or substance abuse issues that should be considered when it comes to crafting a punishment. But ultimately the judge makes the punishment decisions, the sentencing decisions.
And how long have you been conducting these types of evaluations?
29 years, it'll be 30 years next year.
Now, when you conduct these types of evaluations, who are you doing it for?
If I'm evaluating a criminal defendant or a kid in the juvenile justice system, the overwhelming majority of time, I'm working for the court. I'm working for the judge. Haven't been hired by the defense, haven't been hired by the prosecutor, but the judge has appointed me to conduct the evaluation and share my opinions with everyone, the defense, the prosecution, and the judge. So that's how I most typically do these kinds of evaluations.
Now, could you explain that a little? Do the judges just look through a phone book and call any old psychologist they want when they are asking to appoint, or when the court's appointing somebody?
I've been told of various ways judges do it, but I've never seen them make the decision.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there a list that you're on?
I am on a list of mental health professionals in the 13th Circuit across the bay in Tampa, and my understanding is that I might frequently be appointed by judges because of my presence on that list of qualified mental health professionals.
When you conduct evaluations such as this one, the mental state at the time of offense, are you usually retained, or who normally retains or hires you?
Sometimes it's the court. Typically, I've been agreed to by the defense and the prosecution to do those evaluations. Sometimes it's the defense and sometimes it's the prosecution.
When you have previously been hired by the defense, have you ever rendered an opinion that is not favorable to the defense?
When conducting an evaluation like this?
Right.
Typically I do.
So typically you, after conducting your evaluation, you would say, hey guys, I'm not going to be helpful to your case. Is that right?
I'm not going to offer an opinion that supports an adjudication of insanity or something like that. Right.
Okay.
Something to that effect.
So fair to say, just because you are retained by one side or the other, that does not affect your opinion.
This is leading.
Is your opinion based on who retained you?
I hope not. I work hard to see that my opinion is independent and objective, but we know that sometimes factors work outside our awareness. That me and every other mental health professional who does these evaluations.
When you are contacted by the defense, is that usually done in a confidential manner?
Yeah, what I would say privileged.
Okay, explain that a little bit.
So, as a non-lawyer, my understanding of the law is that in criminal proceedings, the defense, at least in the state of Florida, has the option of contacting someone like me and asking me that I evaluate their client, and no one knows about that. It's confidential, at least for a period of time. If it turns out that I'm going to come to a courtroom and testify, then of course everyone knows of my involvement. But it may often be the case that the defense hires me, I conduct the evaluation, I give the defense opinions that they don't like, and then I don't write a report and I don't testify. Obviously, that didn't happen here.
Have you ever been hired by the state attorney's office to conduct an evaluation of a defendant regarding insanity?
Certainly. I'm not sure. I think I might have been retained by the state attorney's office in Pinellas County once, but certainly in other circuits, yes. And federal prosecutors too.
Okay. have you previously evaluated defendants that had killed their own children regarding the issue of insanity?
I believe I've conducted sanity evaluations of 3 people accused of killing their children.
And in those 3 times, did you find every time that the defendant was insane?
No.
Prior to being listed, before you were listed as a witness in this case, were you contacted by a colleague regarding this case?
Yes.
Objection.
And
Approach.
Yes.
Do you want to approach again briefly?
did another expert that's involved in this case reach out to you?
Yes.
And who was that?
Dr. Burston.
Okay. And was this prior to you being officially listed as a witness?
Yes.
Okay. Without getting into the specifics of the issue, how did you deal with that?
Because I had not been identified as a witness, and I wanted to respect my understanding of how this should be handled from a legal perspective, I told Dr. Burston that I thought it best that we not discuss the case. And he quickly responded.
Is it unusual for other professionals in the field to contact you regarding cases?
No, and it's not unusual for me to contact my peers too. That's in many cases that's a sign of good practice, being conscientious.
How did you come to be involved in Mr. Jonchuck's case?
I was contacted by attorneys from your office and who queried whether I'd be willing to be retained by your office and evaluate your client with respect to his mental state at the time of the events.
And how much time did you spend with Mr. Jonchuck? What kind of information did you use in reviewing or in reaching your conclusions in the case?
Okay, I can talk about that with a great degree of specificity, or I can talk about it generally, depending on specificity would take a while, generally would take less time.
Well, I guess with more details,
okay.
You would be indicating every witness you reviewed a deposition from?
Yes.
Okay. So as far as the depositions go, did you review a whole lot of depositions?
I reviewed the depositions of many people.
Okay. And then as to the other things that you reviewed, what was that?
My understanding was all the law enforcement investigation materials. As law enforcement worked the case, all the materials they put together and made available to the defense. I also interviewed Mr. Jonchuck on 3 separate occasions for a total of 7.5 hours, 3 different times. I administered psychological tests, and other legal documents that I reviewed included things like Department of Child and Family Service records, medical records documenting treatment at a variety of facilities where by a variety of healthcare professionals that provided treatment to Mr. Jonchuck, some family law records, reports that had been completed by mental health professionals who had evaluated Mr. Jonchuck on this same issue, depositions of the mental health professionals who conducted those reports, phone logs, texting logs, video recording of Mr. Jonchuck's interrogation, a Tampa Bay Times article referencing this case.
Did you review some interviews that witnesses had given to the press or other sources in addition to law enforcement?
A number of video recorded press interviews from people ranging from his attorney to friends to the mother of the decedent to a priest that Mr. Jonchuck had contact with.
And I actually want to back up a little bit. I forgot to ask you, when you were discussing the different kinds of forensic evaluations you conduct, what is a competency evaluation?
Primarily, a competence evaluation is someone's functioning right now, here and now, and the issue that the court has to figure out is if they're impaired in some way such that they can't understand and participate in the legal process. Are you competent to stand trial as you sit here today in the courtroom or as you'll be going to court in a few weeks? Competence to stand trial, competence to proceed.
How is that different from the determination or what you're looking at in a mental state of time of offense evaluation?
Mental state of time of the offense is not how are you doing today? How are you doing back then? 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, at and around the time of the offense. What was your mental state like then? To inform a judge or jury's opinion as to whether you should be held responsible in some way.
Gotcha. So they're fair to say whether somebody can be competent but also insane.
Sure.
Right?
They're
Different.
doing good today.
Okay.
They're functioning well now. They're able to understand and participate in the legal process. But back then, 2 years ago or 4 years ago, they were impaired in such a way that according to the law, they won't be held responsible.
Now, you indicated that you did 3 different interviews with John over about 7.5 hours.
That's correct.
Why did you do 3 short interviews versus 1 long evaluation?
Because in my experience, people fatigue. They just get tired, particularly when you're asking them about some pretty serious and emotional things. So I thought it was good to get a couple looks at the defendant over time. I think if you're going to spend 7 hours with someone, it makes much more sense to break that down into chunks than try to get 7 hours of them, because I just think they fatigue. And particularly if their mental functioning is maybe compromised or limited in some way by psychiatric symptoms or other kinds of impairments.
Would somebody that's experiencing psychiatric symptoms and or taking psychiatric medicine have a more difficult time focusing than somebody not experiencing that?
Quite possibly. I mean, some symptoms of psychiatric illness can be impaired attention, impaired concentration. If there's some of your impairments, then it's going to make it more difficult to interview that person. It's going to make it more difficult to involve them in the evaluation. Not that it can't be done, but it's going to be more of a challenge.
So is it your fatigue or Mr. Jonchuck's fatigue you're worried about?
I think both of our fatigue, right? I mean, I think if I do I've never done a 7-hour interview because I know I wouldn't be good after 5 or 6 hours. I need a break from it. Also, if you chunk it over various times, it allows you to conduct the first contact, take a look at all you talked about, see what you forgot to ask about, see what you need more information on, compare it to the other information you have, try to rectify or make sense of inconsistencies. So I think there's all kinds of reasons that chunking this over time makes for a better evaluation, at least if you're going to spend 7 hours with someone.
When you are tasked with conducting or when you're tasked with forming an opinion on whether somebody was insane at the time of offense, walk us through that process.
Well, the evaluation, how I conduct the evaluation is really structured by the law. And as a non-lawyer, this is how I understand it. The first question is, at and around the time of the offense, was the person experiencing symptoms of a mental disease or defect? And that's sort of old school language for mental illness or intellectual disability or other developmental disorder. At and around the time of the offense, was the person experiencing symptoms of mental illness or other kinds of impairments? All right? Then, if the answer to that is yes, what impairments? What symptoms? And did any of those symptoms make it so that the defendant didn't know the nature and consequences of his actions, didn't know what he was doing, or didn't know what he was doing was wrong? First question, was the person experiencing symptoms of mental illness at and around the time of the offense? If your answer to that is, well, if your answer to that is no, we're done. Right? If your answer to that is yes, then the next question is, were those symptoms operating in such a way that they made it so the person didn't know the nature and consequences of their actions, what they were doing, or that their actions were wrong, the wrongfulness of their actions? And so that's how I focus my evaluation. Of course, I want to learn a lot about the person. I want to establish rapport. But all the information I'm gathering largely gets to those issues.
And what kind of information do mental health professionals typically rely on when reaching that specific issue?
Different mental health professionals do it different ways. There's not just one way that mental health professionals do it. I think all mental health professionals interview the defendant for a number of reasons. One is to find out if there is a history of mental health problems, because that sort of helps facilitate your understanding of whether they're experiencing mental health problems at the time of the offense. You're also going to talk to the defendant about how they were thinking, feeling, and behaving at and around the time of the offense. Were they experiencing symptoms, and were the symptoms affecting their thinking or their feeling or their behaving in such a way that they didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't know what they were doing was wrong? That's the legal standard, as I understand it, as a non-lawyer. So you want to interview the defendant and get him to weigh in, or you want to get her to weigh in, but it would be naive simply to stop there, right? Because defendants might not be candid, they might not be straight, right? So you also want to look for other information sources that might give you insight into whether the person was experiencing symptoms of mental illness at and around the time of the offense. Is that a hospital record that was completed the day before the offense? Is that the testimony of the defendant's mother, father, sister, wife, who saw him the day of the offense or immediately prior to the offense? Is it the opinion of mental health professionals or the observations of mental health professionals who saw him after his arrest while he was in jail? What about the observations of the officer who arrested the defendant in terms of how he was thinking, how he was behaving, what he was saying, how he was acting? So what we do is we look at all kinds of data sources. And when we do these evaluations, we teach and we talk about using multiple data sources. You don't simply rely on what the person tells you, because they might not be straight, they might not be candid. You look at all kinds of data sources. Okay? We might also administer psychological testing. Keep in mind, though, that most psychological tests, they tell us about how the person's doing today when we administer the test. They don't tell us how they were doing 2 years ago or 2 months ago when the offense was committed. But in some cases, those tests can nonetheless be helpful. Okay? So that's the kind of thing we do. We gather all kinds of data, which is, as I told you, I reviewed the arrest reports. I reviewed a deposition of the officer who first came upon Mr. Jonchuck. I reviewed depositions of Mr. Jonchuck's family members. I reviewed the jail medical record documenting his behavior after the arrest. I reviewed the hospital record that documented his behavior months after his arrest while he was hospitalized. I reviewed records referencing his treatment years before the offense. All of this with an idea towards informing my opinion about whether Mr. Jonchuck has a mental disorder and what kinds of symptoms he might have been experiencing at and around the time of the offense.
Were you able to render an opinion on whether you believe Mr. Jonchuck has a mental disorder?
Yes, I believe Mr. Jonchuck has a mental disorder.
And what is your diagnosis?
I offered a number of diagnoses, and just to be comprehensive, I won't rely on my memory. And my diagnosis is schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination of impaired thinking, psychotic-like symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there, believing things that aren't true, along with impaired mood, problems with your mood, schizoaffective disorder, along with a personality disorder, which is sort of an enduring pattern of behavior. I think the primary features of that are some antisocial features and what we call borderline features, in terms of that's manifested by things like really problematic interpersonal relationships and poorly controlled mood and emotions. And I also identified a number of substance use disorders that reflected his functioning in the past. A history of stimulant use disorders, things like ecstasy and crystal methamphetamine, based on his self-report, cannabis use disorder, marijuana, problematic marijuana use, and then alcohol use disorder, problematic alcohol use. So they're my many diagnoses of Mr. Jonchuck.
Now, does a personality disorder cause psychosis?
No, I would say no. I think personality disorder should be distinguished from almost all psychoses, yeah.
What symptoms do you believe Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing at the time of offense?
At and around. Prior to and at the time of the offense, I believe Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing many symptoms of mental disorder based on what he told me, based on the accounts offered by many of those people who were around him, like a couple of the priests that he met with in the hours preceding the offense, like his mother, like his father, like some of his friends and acquaintances, also the attorney that he consulted with, Ms. Torres. So I believe he was experiencing symptoms based on all their accounts, and the symptoms I believe he was experiencing included auditory hallucinations, reporting that he heard a Bible knock, auditory hallucinations, auditory hearing hallucination, something, you're sensing something that doesn't exist, hearing a Bible knock, auditory hallucinations. He also said that he was hearing voices directing him to do certain things and not do certain things, auditory hallucinations in the forms of voices directing him to do things. Paranoid delusions. Delusions are fixed, false beliefs. Fixed, they don't go away. False, they're inaccurate beliefs. Paranoid is, I think paranoid sort of self-explanatory, maybe suspicious. Believing that his daughter was possessed. Right? Referencing his daughter chanting. Referencing his daughter chanting when she put her hand on the Bible. Believing that people in his family were being affected by Chinese drywall. Believing that canned food in the pantry was spoiling, perhaps because of Chinese drywall. Paranoid delusions. Believing that the world was coming to an end. Believing that Michael the Archangel, right? Michael the Archangel is the angel who protects us from the devil, if you read and believe in the Bible. Protects us against the devil's army. Michael had fallen or was about to fall. Believing that he was the Pope. Believing that his attorney was God, or maybe if she wasn't God, as she denied, that he was God. Believing that his attorney had recently returned from Babylon. Okay. Those kinds of fixed false beliefs resulting from mental disorder, we call them delusions. So I think there's some of the symptoms he was experiencing. Believing that the world was coming to an end, there was an ice age coming, and one way to prevent this might be for his death and the death of his daughter. Okay. Fixed false beliefs. Okay. Believing that an exorcism was necessary. I attribute all of these beliefs to mental disorder. I'm going to call them delusions.
Now, if somebody denies a delusion, does that mean that it is no longer a delusion?
I guess the question is why? What's the basis of the denial? I mean, sometimes delusions go away, typically not quickly, but sometimes delusions, what we call remit, they go away. So I'd have to ask, what was the context?
Did you have an opportunity to review Father Bill's?
Swingross?
Yes, I have a real problem with that. Swingross, did you have an opportunity to review his statement to the police and his deposition?
Yeah, I reviewed, I did.
And regarding, he had indicated that Mr. Jonchuck said he was the Pope, but when challenged said he was no longer the Pope.
Yeah, I don't think delusions turn off that quickly. If someone has a belief flowing from a mental disorder that they're the Pope or that Michael the Archangel has fallen, it doesn't switch like that. It doesn't go away like that.
Is it common for people suffering from delusions to deny that they're suffering from delusions?
They may deny them, or they might not state them if they believe there's going to be some negative outcome. Maybe that, I think, from a common sense perspective.
And what about hallucinations? Is it common for people experiencing hallucinations to perhaps deny those or try to ignore them?
Certainly some people who experience auditory or visual hallucinations deny them. Some people try to ignore them because they're disconcerting, they're troubling, they're scary.
The symptoms that you had just run through, would those be characteristic of the schizoaffective diagnosis?
Those kinds of symptoms and others lead me or support or the basis for my schizoaffective disorder diagnosis.
Could you explain to us the difference between a diagnosis of schizophrenia versus a diagnosis of schizoaffective?
Schizophrenia is going to be, it's a severe mental illness, and it's going to be primarily characterized by impairment in terms of how someone thinks and how they interact with people. So what you might see is confusion in their thinking. They don't reference things in a logical manner. They don't think what you would say is logical. They might also demonstrate some of these unusual beliefs, delusions we'll call them. So that's what you might see in schizophrenia, and their ability to communicate and interact with people is going to be compromised as a result of that. And then you asked to compare that to
schizoaffective.
Schizoaffective disorder. You're going to see some of that along with, accompanied by some significant problems with mood and the experience of emotion.
Is it unusual for a treating psychiatrist or psychologist to initially diagnose schizophrenia and then that diagnosis change over time to schizoaffective?
First of all, it's not uncommon for mental health professionals to change their diagnoses at all, from this to that, or schizophrenia to schizoaffective illness, as they get to know the person and get to know them better. It's no different than when you go to your general practitioner or the specialist who's treating you for some kind of gynecologic or cardiac problem. They form an impression, They get some ideas, they come up with some diagnosis, then maybe they conduct some tests, maybe they ask you some more questions, maybe they spend some more time with you, and they refine the diagnosis or they change the diagnosis. So changing diagnoses is not uncommon in mental health or healthcare more generally.
Do you believe that Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing symptoms of a mental disorder at and around the time of offense that affected his understanding of the nature and consequences of his behavior?
Yes.
Why do you think that?
My opinion is that Mr. Jonchuck was significantly impaired by these symptoms of mental disorder, by the delusions, the paranoid delusions. The world was coming to an end. His daughter was possessed. There's an ice age coming. His grandiose delusions. He's the Pope. No, his attorney's the Pope. No, so she's Saint Genevieve, who came from Babylon. No, she came from Montreal. His illogical thinking, right? My understanding is that he instructed Ms. Torres, his attorney. He instructed her that he was about to go to the church to get baptized with his daughter. Then his next response was, well, why don't I leave my daughter here with you so I can go get baptized? And her response was, well, wait a minute, I thought it was you and your daughter. That's just illogical, right? And as I heard Ms. Torres testify, that's what I think she said. She said that just wasn't rational. That didn't make sense to her. That's the kind of irrational, illogical thinking that you can see resulting from mental disorder. So thinking's irrational and illogical. There's these delusions. There's these hallucinations. Bibles are knocking. A daughter's chanting. I don't think Phoebe was chanting. Voices are commenting to him and talking to him about the end of the world. I think all of that is operating and affecting his understanding of the nature and consequences of his behavior.
Doctor, how is it possible for Mr. Jonchuck to be experiencing all of these delusions and operate a vehicle?
Mental disorder doesn't render you incapacitated, even when you're experiencing some symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness like Mr. Jonchuck was. Certainly some people with severe and persistent mental illness are so incapacitated that they need to be in a hospital room. But you can, and actually maybe that's where Mr. Jonchuck did need to be that day, right? But you can still do things. People with severe and persistent mental illness, they still eat. They still prepare food. They still drive motor vehicles. They still communicate with people, although not near as well as people without severe and persistent mental illness, as demonstrated maybe by some of the things that Mr. Jonchuck said to all the people around him, right? Salt around the windows of a house to keep evil spirits out. That's irrational. That's illogical, right? Saying that you're going to get your daughter baptized, but you want to leave your daughter behind. Being fully capable of driving your daughter to the church, but then asking your attorney for a ride for no apparent reason. Claiming your attorney who returned from vacation came from Babylon. So all of that is significant impairment, but that doesn't mean that people can't nonetheless still do things and still function in some basic ways. Not everyone with symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness is in a hospital bed.
So can somebody be suffering from severe and persistent mental illness, have the thought that they're hungry, and actually carry that out to making a meal and eating it?
Sure. Just go to downtown St. Petersburg. Just go to downtown Tampa and look at people who are homeless, and a subset of those people have severe and persistent mental illness. That's in part why they're homeless. Are they living and surviving? Barely, right? Sometimes they're asking for money. Sometimes they're lucky enough to get people to give them food. They're terribly impaired. Some of those people are talking to themselves. Some of those people believe that the city administrators are conspiring against them. Maybe they're even accusing us of conspiring against them. they're terribly impaired. They're getting by, barely, but they're getting by. They're getting food, they're getting dressed, they're living at some basic level.
Is there anything about, can somebody suffer from severe and persistent mental illness and still be able to make and keep appointments?
Yes.
Do you believe that Mr. Jonchuck was experiencing symptoms of mental disorder at and around the time of offense that affected his understanding of the wrongfulness of his behavior?
Yes.
And why do you think that?
So, Mr. Jonchuck, my understanding is Mr. Jonchuck was on the approach to the Sunshine Skyway, what people commonly refer to as the Dick Meisner Bridge. He stopped the vehicle and he was confronted by a law enforcement officer. The law enforcement officer was right there with him, gave him commands that he refused to carry out. And not only did he do that, he committed a terrible offense right in front of the officer's eyes, right? My understanding is a gun was trained on him. The officer gave him commands, and nonetheless he carried out that offense and then went about his way. Later when he was apprehended, he asked, my understanding is he asked to be taken, dropped off at the airport. He asked, what had you done that was so wrong? He asked if he could be released from the interrogation room. Okay. This all to me suggests at least some impairment in appreciating that he had done something absolutely terrible.
Did you have any indication that Mr. Jonchuck was on drugs at and around the time this happened?
I saw nothing indicating that.
Was there, is it your opinion that he was on drugs at the time?
I don't have that opinion. I am of the opinion that he was not on drugs.
Your opinion is that he was not on drugs at the
Yeah,
time?
based on the data I reviewed and was provided.
Okay. Do you have an opinion on whether Mr. Jonchuck is just making all this up?
Yes.
And what's that?
He's not making it up. He's not malingering mental illness. He's not faking, is my opinion.
And could you explain what malingering is?
Malingering is exaggerating or fabricating impairment in order to avoid or to get some kind of goal or avoid some kind of negative outcome. So maybe you might exaggerate and fabricate your depression so you can get on disability. You're not really depressed, but you're going to claim you are so you can get disability benefits or not have to go to work or something like that. It's exaggerating or fabricating impairment, psychological impairment or physical impairment in order to get some kind of external reward or avoid something that is negative from your perspective.
Did you do any kind of testing to determine whether Mr. Jonchuck was feigning any psychosis when you spoke with him?
I did.
And what was that?
I administered something called the Structured Interview of Reported Symptoms. It is a test specifically designed to identify people who exaggerate or fabricate symptoms of psychosis, hearing voices, believing you're the King of England, believing there's a conspiracy against you. A test specifically designed to identify people exaggerating certain kinds of impairments, what we'll call psychotic spectrum impairments, symptoms of psychosis, things like delusions and hallucinations and confused thinking. I administered that test.
Did you what were the results, I guess?
His performance on the test his performance were consistent with someone who, at the time I was interviewing him, was not exaggerating. symptoms of psychosis. His answers in no way suggested he was exaggerating or fabricating impairments at the time I tested him.
When you were meeting with Mr. Jonchuck, did he exhibit any kind of thought blocking?
In my opinion, yes.
Could you explain what thought blocking is?
So one indicator or symptom of psychosis that I haven't mentioned is sometimes it's difficult to think in a linear and logical way, and sometimes your thoughts don't always follow one after the other. Okay? So what you'll sometimes see when you're interviewing someone who's experiencing psychosis, including schizoaffective disorder, is you ask them a question and they don't immediately respond. They're having difficulty processing either what you said or they're having difficulty coming up with a response. Now, I'm sure many of you are saying, well, yeah, that happens to me, right? But it doesn't happen to you with the same kind of frequency and consistency that happens to someone who's experiencing symptoms of psychosis. So oftentimes when you're interviewing someone who is experiencing symptoms of psychosis, their responses to your questions might be delayed. Or sometimes they say, well, what was it you asked? I forgot what you asked me, or can you repeat the question? And they're having difficulty organizing and sharing their thoughts.
If you were interviewing somebody that in a hospital setting on the level of medication that Mr. Jonchuck was on, and you notice some of those delayed responses or losing track mid-sentence and thought, would you attribute that to faking or malingering?
I guess it could. I guess it could indicate faking or malingering. A couple things. One I'll also say is that some of the medications that Mr. Jonchuck was on probably resulted in some of those slow responses. Those medications can sedate you and make you drowsy sometimes, so that might have been the explanation. Yeah, maybe someone is not responding to the question because they're trying to think up the answer that makes them look impaired or whatever. Yeah, maybe. That's sort of inconsistent with the results of the psychological testing I did that suggested no effort to exaggerate or fabricate those kinds of symptoms, but I guess.
So the malingering testing you did was to, in part, to show if that's actually thought blocking that's occurring. Is that correct?
Well, no, sort of. The test I administered was to determine whether Mr. Jonchuck, when he met with me, was exaggerating or fabricating symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness, like the kinds of symptoms he reported experiencing back on the evening that he put his daughter off the side of the Dick Meisner approach to the Sunshine Skyway. His performance on that test leads me to believe that he wasn't exaggerating or fabricating psychotic symptoms when he was with me, including thought blocking or impaired attention and concentration.
Is there anything about being in a state of psychosis or experiencing great psychosis that affects your recollection of events later?
Sure. Consistently, people who are in a psychotic state, their thinking's confused. They're holding all these unusual ideas or beliefs that we'll call delusions. They're hearing voices. Oftentimes, they report difficulty recounting with great accuracy what happened. Why? Because their mental state was impaired, right? Their mental state was significantly impaired. So whether it was sort of making sense of things and encoding the information in memory, or whether it's retrieving it, it is not uncommon at all for people who are experiencing what we'll call psychotic episodes, where they're experiencing delusions and hallucinations and confused and irrational thinking, for them to tell you, I don't remember everything. It's a blur. It's confusing. I remember this, but I don't remember that.
Judge may approach.
This is a good stopping point for us to take our lunch break, so we'll be in a lunch and recess till 1:15. Thank you for your cooperation.
All right. You know the drill.